Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. My name is Charlie Wood from Diversity and Ability. I'm the Higher Education Relations Lead here at the organisation. And I'm joined today by Adam Hyland and Piers Wilkinson. We thought we'd come together because we're in a really unique and interesting situation where, as part of an organisation that really celebrates lived experience, one of our directors, Adam Hyland, and also a new member of our higher education team, Piers Wilkinson, were both previously disabled student officers at NUS. And what's really interesting about their roles is they're almost exactly, not quite, but almost exactly 10 years apart. So we thought now would be a really good time to come together and speak about their experiences at the NUS, but also in the world of disabled students in higher education, and kind of the challenges that may or may not have changed in those 10 years. So you can see on the screen, there's obviously three of us here. I'm not sure if he's below me, to the right of me, to the left of me. But either way, first of all, I'll introduce again, Adam Hyland. He's our, actually Adam, you go ahead. What's your role at DNA?
Thank you, Joe. I'm Adam Hyland. I'm one of the co-founders of Diversity and Ability, and I'm the Director of Accessibility and Inclusion.
Perfect. And you were the Disabled Students Officer in, I think we've got down there, 2008 to 2010. So 2 terms.
Indeed, yeah.
Down there, perfect. And then again, above, below, just beside me is Piers. You go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you, Charlie. I'm Piers. I was the NUS National Union of Students Disabled Students Officer for 2019-2020 to 2020, before the role was unfortunately cut. And I now am part of the wonderful higher education team with DNA as the Higher Education and Student Partnerships Coordinator, because we all love long titles.
Great stuff. Thank you, Piers. So I thought I'd kick it off, Adam, by asking you kind of two questions, really. Firstly, would you be able to briefly explain the role of a disabled students officer, and also what then motivated you to joining or applying for the role in the first place?
Sure. I mean, the role of a disabled student officer, I think, is quite a unique one. Really, you're mandated by the disabled student membership at NUS to represent them the best you can in terms of making sure that disabled student voices are heard, firstly within NUS, but of course much wider in terms of the higher education sector policy that impact on disabled students, and again the wider society, making sure that disabled students' voices are heard and disabled students are represented where it matters and where decisions are impacted on disabled students. And secondly, I guess run national campaigns to make sure we can impact disabled students' lives in a positive way. That, for me, is the main goal of the role. And of course, it's not a job that you can apply for traditionally. You have to be elected by disabled students, so it's very much in an autonomous role where you really are representing the very people that elect you. Why did I get involved? Well, being a disabled student myself, and seeing the barriers that disabled students face, I always believe that if you want to see change, you need to make it. You need to help make that change. And I wanted to get involved and be in a position that I could try and break down some of those barriers that I faced and fellow friends faced at university. So that's what I wanted to do. And if I'm honest, when the current disabled student officer comes or not, says that he wants to back you in an election, you don't really say no.
Yeah, perfect. Piers, was it a similar reason, motive for you?
I mean, I think behind every disabled students officer role, like that's ever held the role, there's been that motivation to make change and to at least make it so that a disabled student doesn't experience what you've experienced and the barriers that you experienced. I think it's a little different for me because it was kind of like stumbling into the entire world of disabled student politics for me. I started off, I went to university in North Wales in Bangor. So my first stepping stones were within sort of NUS Wales, which is an autonomous other nation's part of NUS UK. It's a whole fun system of organizations, nations, and that sort of thing. But basically it's its own thing. It had its own liberation campaign, disabled students campaign. And then from there, it was Wales Disabled Students Officer, and then I went to NUS UK after I'd done that for a year or two. And that was really because for those that are savvy with Wales, know that whilst a lot of things are devolved, like education and transport and healthcare and things like that, there's a lot that the UK government in Westminster do control and have significant influence over Wales. So the primary reason why I made that sort of shift into UK politics for UK representation was I really wanted to represent disabled students, but also ensure that students that had that sort of hybrid, I'm in Wales, so I've got a little bit of Wales stuff to do, but also the UK government is screwing me and this, that, and the other. So it was almost exactly the same sort of principles and reasons, but I had the additional sort of kick up the backside by my Welsh disabled student colleagues saying we'd really like it for someone to have experience in the national role to have had a nation's perspective.
What experience do you think you took from that national role in Wales to the wider NUS when you started this sort of election process? Were there things from your manifesto before that you took into the NUS election process?
I think the key sort of like skills or understanding that I took across was how to effectively engage the people that you're supposed to represent. Because one of the big issues with Wales, if any disabled person's ever been to Wales, it's not exactly flat. Travel routes around there, if I wanted to go from North Wales to South Wales, it was almost 11 hours because you have to go all the way out into England, down England, and then all the way back in. So a lot of my organizing experience, and I stood on a manifesto sort of centered on that, was about doing things in a way that meant that you didn't have to be somewhere in person. We'd really pioneered that in Wales, particularly because if you're in North Wales, you're not really going to Cardiff. It's actually easier to get to London than it is to Cardiff sometimes.
Yeah.
So we had that experience of organizing to include as many people as possible, particularly for disabled students when we can't get in the room. And that was one of the things that was really, with the advent of digital technology, that was really key around sort of my main sort of platform was engaging disabled students from across the country that couldn't be in the room. Because historically, and still even now, you have to be in the room per se to be able to vote. In every democratic situation, and if you're not in the room to vote, then you sometimes feel like you're not actually involved in the process. So that was one of the core aspects that I wanted to metaphorically stand for. As a wheelchair user, there wasn't anything I was standing.
And Adam, nearly 10 years ago now, I know smartphones were just becoming a thing in 2008. Were they a thing? I think they were an early thing, weren't they? The early iPhone was kind of those couple of years. Was digital kind of accessibility one of the main parts of your manifesto back then, or were there other aspects that you also focused on?
Thank you for that age check. Johnny. As long as I don't remember much about to do accessibility. I don't even think it was on our radar back then.
Yeah.
To be honest, I do know I stood on manifestos around looking at the transition between further education and higher education, and we did a research project and report on the barriers that disabled students face when leaving FE to go to HE. We did again put a whole list of recommendations to the Department for Education. But again, I think sadly, if you were to go back and look at that report, you could probably see the barriers that were highlighted back then still to this day. We did do another main campaign that we ran back in those days were around social care and higher education. So for disabled students that needed personal care and social support, the idea of moving away to university because they wanted to go to uni that was really good on the subject, or they wanted to get away from family maybe. Often that wasn't the choice for disabled students that needed personal care, because a lot of students knew that in order to get the care that they needed or support that they needed, they're more likely to get the funding in their local authority than they were to move away and get that same personal budget to be able to live independently. So again, we did a huge piece of work around that. That was called Life Not Numbers. And that was a big part of work. And of course, finally, in those times, it was when the SOC took over the administration from local authorities for the disabled student allowance, and I think it's fair to say, putting it politely, it didn't go too well.
So they from the ground up had to set up the infrastructure in the year that you were there. That was when you oversaw the beginning of it.
Definitely, it was between 08 and 08 and 09, it all changed.
Wow.
But the impact was still going on. My second year, and disabled students were having to wait up to a year and a half to get their DSA funds or get their DSA processed and get their funds in place, which, as you can imagine, had a huge negative impact on disabled students. And that was really what kick-started my getting to know the Teeth, who's the CEO of DNA, and all what he was doing at the time to keep disabled students on campus. So lots going on.
Yeah, because I'm thinking back at that time, and there was so many things going on in the world of politics. Obviously, with the main tuition fee rise, that was around that time, wasn't it? And various things coming through, and I can only imagine knowing how sort of major a role SLC play now. The idea of that coming from the ground up while all these other things were going on, I can only imagine what it was like. So, do you think one of the main issues or challenges you encountered when you were in office was those changes, the turbulent changes that were going on in the realms of finance?
Definitely. I think, and I don't think anyone's coming really. I think we knew there might be teething issues. because local authorities have been administrating DSA for years.
Yeah.
But the idea of this big organisation coming in and being able to centralise it all and make it easier and quicker, and yeah, on the very surface seems a good idea, but in reality, I think it's fair to say that SLC took a while to really understand how much resource was needed to provide the services disabled students need.
Yeah, for sure. And just the admin side of it, just the amount of admin that is required, the emails that need to be sent, the DFTs need to be processed. It's so admin heavy that I can't imagine what it might be like in those early days when they were establishing their fleet.
And the DSA 1 form was even longer than what it is today. And that's quite a feat, you know. And if I'm honest, quite sadly, it was the Disabled Student Campaign at the time that really started to introduce the concept of student choice into SLC, having disabled student representation, because before then, they didn't have any disabled students as stakeholders. We changed that, and SLC at the time worked with us to make sure NUS were a key stakeholder.
That's interesting. So I suppose, yes, it appears then looking on from that, we don't want to spend too much time on SLC because again, that's a whole other video. But in terms of things being turbulent and there being bureaucratic processes that were out of your hands, was that still a challenge when you were in post, or do you think things had simmered down a bit and plateaued and you were able to kind of find your feet a bit more without having to spend too much time head up there in bureaucracy?
I think I was in a very nice position before I took office. I was the sort of like the second-hand person for the campaign, which is commonly known as the NEC second place, the National Executive Council second place. And I'd been working with the officer that was before mine, Rachel O'Brien, and she did 2 years, and during those 2 years I was her second-hand man, as it were. And I out of the two of us, I had a much of a greater penchant for bureaucracy. So I'd already sort of been involved in the more bureaucratic leanings. And I would say that it was definitely not as turbulent as 2008, 2010, 2011. Those 3 years in particular, they're still shaping how things happen today. But we did have the Office for Students get set up and sort of start its process sort of in 2018, 2019. And then obviously we've seen them become much more active in regards to disabled student inclusion with their whole access and participation plan and all that sort of stuff going on at the moment for universities. However, I think the core issues that sort of like the bureaucratic challenges, the administrative challenges, they're all still there. We're all still filling out so much paperwork. The transitions are still hard. I just think instead of it being a really nice, easy thing of, student loans company bit off more than they could chew when setting up DSA, they've sort of inbuilt it into the system now. So I think that there's less, there's been successes, but now it's much harder to sort of identify where the stumbling blocks are in the process than when it could, with the big issues that were when it was set up, when it was still being molded. We have much more, whilst I was consulted during my time, SLC and OFS and Department for Education would always sort of come knocking whenever they, wanted our opinion on something. The impact that I felt we actually had on the changes that they were implementing, I think, is probably less now than during Adam's time. And I think that is something that we've lost. I think is a little bit of impact, and that's because obviously the system wasn't as new. Obviously Adam shaped it to a certain extent, whereas we were just nitpicking. We were just going, that doesn't work. This is a barrier. We would like it to look like this. And unfortunately, student choice, one of the things that I had to fight during my entire term was the removal of student choice and the scaling back of student choice. So we had something resembling student choice for a good 10 years, and the good strides had been made, but that progress is still under threat and still being thought to have been cut back. So we've made a lot of progress, I think, having listened to Adam, but we've also we're fighting a lot of the similar sort of issues, like principally as 10 years ago.
In terms of, quite interesting there, you mentioned the Office for Students and how the development of that coincided with when you were in post. What kind of role, or was there any role that NUS played in the creation of that body? Were you kind of consulted at all and brought into that discussion?
We weren't consulted per se. However, we did have a say in things. We had a pressure, I think is the right word. Particularly with, you may have heard of it was a little bit before my time to a certain extent, but I was still involved with NUS as a volunteer with a certain individual. I won't name him because I don't want him to get any popularity on Twitter or social media, but a certain infamous individual was appointed to the Office for Students and to a post in higher education that had no real business or experience being in that post. So we were able to get some changes. We obviously, disabled student inclusion is a massive priority. It's one of the top priorities, one of the 4 main priorities of the Office for Students. And I think that wouldn't have happened per se if it hadn't been for the friendly overtures and the discussions that had been built up to that point. I think it's fair to say, and Adam I think will probably agree, that the Disabled Students Campaign throughout its time has always had a closer working relationship with government offices. So that, Department for Work and Pensions, Department for Education, and now the Office for Students, which is independent but a part of DfE.
Yeah.
Comparative to the other campaigns in the other sections of NUS, because we're so integrated into the processes, our support is so structurally linked nationally to those bodies now that we have a lot more, day-to-day, I say day-to-day meetings, weekly meetings with those bodies to influence and shape how they talk about things.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, that does sound like a positive legacy in terms of getting, like you said, the not the reasonable adjustment plans. What are those plans? The PP
access and participation plans.
Getting those on Office of Student website does seem like a great thing, great sort of way to get it out there of the sort of the formality that is now in place. Okay, perfect. Yeah, and then Adam, I suppose for your term in office, any sort of big legacies that you can pull from, think of right now that you're really, really happy with?
We made at the time SOC really sit up and understand the impact that the administration change had on disabled students. And like I said, at the time they did listen and they did put resources in. So I hope in terms of legacy that we did help in getting out of a situation that was quite dire for disabled students, and it really was dire.
Yeah.
I would also like to think, although I'm sure Piers and I know I've spoken to Bill about this, he will sadly occasionally one of my biggest things at the time was to get NUS as an organisation to be more inclusive, because I've always been a believer that before we go out telling people what they're not doing, like, actually we need to get our own house in order. So things like moving the disabled students conference to a more accessible venue. I can say I did that, or we did that as a team. I would like to also think as a legacy that there's no more national conferences that start at 8:30 in the morning and go on until 1:30 at night like they used to do. I don't know whether that has sadly crept in or not, but that's what it used to be like, and I think it's fair to say that is not acceptable for any student, let alone students that may face barriers around energy and fatigue and concentration.
Yeah.
So I like to think at the time another legacy was leaving NUS more inclusively accessible one than what it was. Whether it stayed at that or not, I'm sure is retained. And then I guess finally legacy, although it wasn't at NUS, I think I like to think that through meeting and Teep and knowing what Teep was doing, legacy of DNA started, and the importance of having lived experience as part of the delivery and support that the DSA provides to more disabled students.
Yeah. And is there anything, again, hindsight is a great thing, but 10 years later down the line, is there anything you wish you campaigned more heavily for, or you'd done differently at your time at NUS?
Oh, crikey. So that is a big and complex question. I think for me, you always stand on a manifesto that you believe in.
Yeah.
Or indeed, I think you should stand on a manifesto that you believe in, that you think you can deliver. I think, if I'm honest, I don't think you quite fully understand the magnitude and the breadth and depth of the role until you're in it. I think, DSA is only a small, not a small part, DSA is only one part to play in the role of the disabled students officer. We're working on around things around the Equalities Act, around mental health services in the NHS. So I guess to answer your question, I wish that we had more resources to do more.
Yeah.
I don't think it was, you have to complete what you're saying, you complete and deal with things that come up that you don't see at the time. Like SOC change.
Yeah, that's it. It's tough. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. This is the way to measure, I suppose.
Good question.
Yes, Piers, Adam mentioned there, resources being often the big thing for any organisation, let alone the NUS. Now, I'm right in saying that since you left, I know fault of your own, but since you left, the role of the Disabled Students Officer has changed, and often that was because of resource issues later on down the line.
Yeah, I do just want to say that Adam's work to make NUS more inclusive was still around during my time. But ironically, not going to brag or anything, but the work that myself and some volunteers and some of the officers in between did with the Disabled Students campaign grew it to the point that we actually outgrew that accessible hotel and conference centre that Adam had chosen. And moved us to. So I spent the first, I think, 3.5 months of one of the sort of volunteer role terms that I had, supporting the events team to test out and find a new hotel and conference centre so that we can actually accommodate the 100 to 150 disabled people that all wanted to turn up for our wonderful yearly conference. So it was both the legacy was still there, but then we had another issue where, because of our predecessors and because of the work that we'd done as volunteers, it had grown to such a size that it was no longer accessible. particularly if there was a fire alarm. That was a routine issue. If there was a fire alarm in the hotel at night, then quite a few wheelchair users were stacked up in the refuge points. But in terms of resource, yeah, unfortunately, at the closure of my role back in June, July, the post was and campaign as a whole was cut and amalgamated with all the 4 other campaigns, 5 in total, liberation campaigns, I should say. The 5 liberation campaigns were amalgamated into one role, so they basically slashed it by 80% down to one individual that would have to cover the entirety of liberation, and sort of made the Disabled Students Officer role into a committee place.
Right.
And I think it is about resource. It's about what people prioritize and what they value most. And as Adam said, when you first step into the role of, or for both Adam and I, maybe it's wheel into the role of Disabled Students Officer, you do, even as someone that had a full-time role with that financial support of a full-time salary packet, with a whatever our campaign budgets were, we had a little bit of a campaign budget. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. You will always spread yourself too thin. The way in which disabled students encounter higher education and further education, it's not enough for one individual. And I think that it is a real shame, and it's going to be a really big loss for the sector in particular, because as we've heard from Adam and myself, disabled students officers really have shaped the sector and designed the sector. Adam's time, it was the shaping of SLC and how a student choice should be embedded into it. One thing that I'm incredibly proud of is the digital accessibility regulations that have come out. I was part of shaping that, and even culturally picking it up. We're seeing student unions and universities using alt text more on their social media posts.
Yeah.
And being able to include disabled students. We're now talking about disabled students' experiences as an entire experience, not just academic. Beforehand, it was, can you access your lecture? Can you access your library? Can you access your accommodation room? After that, it doesn't really matter about anything else. But we know that that's not true. You've got societies, you've got career opportunities, you've got business fairs, you've got all of these wonderful experiences that are part of the education experience. Now that's on the table. So that's something that I think has built upon year upon year upon year of each successive officer. And without that voice, that staunch, slightly grumpy disabled person in the room going, no, we need to ensure that our choice is here. We need to ensure that we're here, because I'm sure Adam will agree, even during my entire time as a disabled student officer, every single meeting that I went to, it was highly likely that I wouldn't just be the only disabled student in the room. I might actually be the only disabled person in the room as well. And losing that voice, I think, is going to put a greater slide on what we saw in the last couple of years of my sort of time in student volunteering and politics, where it was trying to get rid of student voice, trying to scale back some of the progress we'd achieved.
What was the reaction?
Sorry, do you mind, just because I think it's a really good celebration point, actually, Piers alluded to the fact that I had to move hotels because the campaign got bigger. I know that in my time we broke the record of having 73 disabled student representatives at the conference. So I think the fact that Piers has said that up to 150 delegates in his time shows the progress that has been made in terms of student voice, student representation within NUS and the sector. So I just wanted to congratulate all my successors on that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I suppose I don't want to spend too much time on the negatives, but the fact that that now role doesn't exist in the same way it did when you both were in it. is it a situation where they've almost gone, oh well, we've now ticked that box. Everyone is now everywhere is now accessible. Job done. We'll reduce the role because mission accomplished, kind of thing. Yeah, that's quite a sort of a controversial thing to say, I suppose, and sort of attitude to have. But it does, I suppose, kind of seem that way. If in 10 years you've seen that progress, there's no reason why for another 10 years it can go even more if it hadn't been maybe affected by this reduction in the role.
I think it's very much, I very much wouldn't say that it's, job done. I think if anything, whilst we have achieved such good progress, what it's done is just highlight even more inequality. You close one door and 15 more open in front of you, particularly on intersections between the liberation campaigns. We'd been getting really good at working together in such a way that we were able to work off of each other and include disabled people of color, queer disabled people, and identify some of the cross-liberation issues that realistically, the majority of disabled people are queer, according to most statistics. Majority of queer people have a disability, and it's one of these very close intersections that we'd starting to work on, and it was only just being talked about at the end to a certain extent, particularly when we talk about Pride. In the last 2 years alone, we've seen massive national conversations about the physical access of Pride events. So it wasn't that, it's job done. I think it very much was prioritization of finances. The way in which it happened and was NUS needed to make budget cuts because they'd halved affiliation fees percentage, and they needed to account for the lack of income as a result of that. And we put it to, so I and my other liberation officers put it to the student unions around the country, because we were funded by student unions, and said, look, we've worked out that funding the liberation officers will cost an extra 0.2% of your affiliation fee. Like it will increase your block grant, and it will be 0.2% extra of your affiliation fee. And unfortunately, it wasn't accepted by student unions around the country. It didn't meet it. So I'm hopeful that in maybe 2-3 years' time, that funding becomes available again, and that funding is put back into the position, because I don't know anyone around the country, whether you're in a student union, a university, a college, whether you're in a sector organization or government even, that would say that the liberation roles and the disabled student role, obviously I'm biased, the disabled student role was so incredibly valuable in not just the lived experience, but in being able to identify and highlight issues before they were an issue. We've seen what happens when barriers are built into things because people just haven't thought of things. They haven't thought about it well enough because they just didn't get that voice in there. And it's so much harder to unpick as someone that's been unpicking the SLC DSA system to try and just refine it and make it better, to build on the work that officers like Adam did. To lose that voice and to be on the outside is a little bit disheartening, but there is work being done. It's one of the main reasons that I'm loving working with DNA diversity and ability is I still get to continue a lot of the work on voice and sector representation. And as the last disabled student officer for now, I get to brag that I got 100% of the vote. So it's a nice thing to have finished off on, is having such an overwhelming confidence from the membership to have been I think the only NUS officer in history to get 100% of the vote and not a single Ron. I'm just getting this dig in because I know Adam's here and can hear me, and he's going to say, well, you were uncontested, but Ron did exist, so there was technically another person that someone could vote for.
Well, that's the thing. Although they say the role's changed, it's morphed into something else. Student activism still easily exists and is still very loud, thankfully at the moment. Adam, are there any kind of tips or advice that you'd give current disabled student activists that are studying at the moment?
Get involved. I think we need to make sure that lived experience is key to shaping future policy, future experience in higher education and beyond. And I think, a student union is a key mechanism in making sure those voices and that lived experience is heard.
Yeah.
So I would encourage students to get involved, go to a student union, but also feedback into the various university systems. I know that they're not always particularly what is word on the money, I guess, and there's some, it's more data that I think could be collected, that should be collected and isn't. I think give feedback, get involved in the disability service, give them feedback and work to create a better, more inclusive education system. I think for me, and I think sometimes maybe I've seen it where disabled students have had the right to get through their degree, and maybe only found out that they are a disabled student towards the end of it. And I don't think that's an uncommon thing. And I think sometimes because the energy that goes into completing your degree, you sometimes think, oh well, I'm at the end now, it doesn't matter. Actually, that's because you can leave a legacy for the next generation of disabled students if you go back and get involved, because that lived experience is so important in forming the future of education.
Yeah, that's spot on. And yeah, I like just the overriding message there is to make your voice heard and to get involved. Just kind of do it. But Piers, I wonder, having someone who's recently been in that role and been in at university, when you are a student, especially if you're an undergrad and say you didn't take any time out and you're just 18, maybe if your birthday's in the summer, and you're a disabled student, you go to university, it's so intimidating being in that place. It's intimidating for anyone, just going to, say, the bar or joining a society, let alone being an activist and really pushing against what seems like a monolithic institution that you might be part of at the time. Have you got any advice on how that first year undergrad can break those kind of concerns and really make their voice heard?
I think the most important thing is what Adam's already touched on, which is make your voice heard. And it doesn't have to be shouting in a megaphone. And, some social activists love doing that. I sometimes really enjoyed it. If I had my ear defenders, I'd stick them on and shout down a megaphone at people. As long as, it was at people that wouldn't have a sensory overload from that. But there is an unwritten, unknown power in an email. Only 1 in 10 disabled people actually complain when they are faced with a barrier. And that evidence or lack of evidence is used by universities in particular to justify not funding things, to not invest in things. An anecdote that I use quite a lot, that I've probably used for a couple of years now, but it's still so very true, is I was part of a meeting where their business case was put forward to purchase a £3,000 site license for assistive technology. And it was turned down because it was said that there wasn't a need for it. And yet the biscuit fund for some of the offices from some of the departments was more than that. They would spend more on food and refreshments in some departments or collectively on than they would invest in a site license for assistive technology that would have mainstreamed inclusion for a lot of disabled students. And that was because there just wasn't enough. They felt like there wasn't enough evidence. So the one thing, you don't have to go out in the cold. You don't have to shout down a megaphone. You don't really have to put your face out there. But make sure you send that email. Ask for the impact assessment, because 9 times out of 10 they've not really done a proper one. Send that complaint that's just one line, just going, I couldn't access this, I'm a disabled student, this isn't acceptable. As long as you are making that voice heard in whatever format you want, it can be on the complaints form, it can be an email, it can be on Twitter even. I've seen so many people achieve some change because the university really cares about their public image. If you tweet at them going, I can't get into my lecture, we've seen some massive stories hit mainstream headlines this year of wheelchair users that were unable to access their lecture theatres before COVID, of course. Now no one can access their lecture theatre, sort of. But it really is the most important aspect that I would say is student activism isn't what you see. 9 times out of 10, it is sending the email to the right person, being a pain in the butt because you're sending an email every week about the same issue over and over and over again. And it takes 5 minutes of your time, to a certain extent, to send an email. But eventually, if every disabled student, when they encountered a barrier, were to send an email, we'd achieve some really, truly significant change within a very short period of time.
Yeah, perfect. And then I suppose lastly, Adam, looking at the role of, again, the university, which is ultimately what the NUS, I imagine, was universities, what they were trying to engage with a lot of the time. I don't know if it's asking for advice. What tips would you give members of that university, staff of that university, disability officers at universities, if they say receive that email from peers highlighting a barrier? What is a productive way of them engaging with that student?
I think it's fair to say that people working in disability services are doing it because they want to make education inclusive. And often they're your biggest allies. And I think it's fair to say that the way the system is set up, that we tend to hear from students and things that aren't going quite right. And I think it's quite tough sometimes to only read the negatives, but I think, for me, the message to disability service staff is to keep doing what you're doing and to take those emails as, I guess, arsenal for your campaign to make sure your services are funded enough. Use those emails not as complaints about what you're doing, but as weapons to get more funding, more recognition from senior management. Because I've been privileged enough to be on a university board, and if I'm honest, it comes down to student experience, league tables, and budgets. And I just think that using the student feedback that we're talking about can be really important, as you and Piers have already highlighted, as ways to really show senior management at these universities that actually disabled students are not a minority. Inclusion is about everybody. And I think, use the lived experience, because without it, we're never going to get inclusion right.
Yeah, no, great point. Perfect. Well, I think we'll wrap up lastly just a quick answer from both of you. That's, imagine we're in 2030, 10 years on from now. COVID-19 is a thing of the past and no one talks about it anymore. Where would you like to see the role of the Disabled Students Officer? That's, imagine it's back in place. Where would you like to see that role, and what changes would you have hoped have happened in the previous 10 years? Piers, do you want to go first?
I'd really like to see in 10 years' time, the student officer back. But I'd like to see them working on the things that we see other students get to work on. The enrichment projects, the diversification of modules, instead of just bare access. For decades now, most of the disabled student officer work has been about just achieving equity of access to education, rather than developing the pure cool parts that we just really want more of, that increase the satisfaction, that give you the career opportunities. So I'd really like to see in 10 years the role be to not have to be fighting over just simple access, to be challenging and on expanding modules and topics and things based on just desire of enrichment, rather than please let us in the room type sort of work that we've had to shout quite loudly and have got some successes on. But that's where I'd like to see the role.
Perfect. Adam, anything to add to that?
Beautifully inspiring. So much work is going into this, fighting for that extra access to education. There's actually so much more to university life. And people have said university days, university days of life. Sadly for disabled students, that's not always the case, because of the barriers that still exist in our society. So I would like to see the disabled students role come back in the next year or so. It needs to be there. We need that lived experience driving policy and change. And it needs to be on, as Piers quite rightly said, the wider issues that the disabled students face, and not just this bare minimum access to education.
Yeah, perfect. Well, I think that's a really great way to end this chat today. Thank you both, Piers and Adam, for sharing your thoughts and your experiences today. And likewise, anyone who's watching or listening who would like to continue this discussion with us, will include our contact details somewhere in this video, and we're welcome to speak to you at a later date. Piers or Adam, any last thoughts?
It's individuals in the further and higher education that truly make the difference for disabled students. And as Adam's already said, there's so many people doing some amazing work, and it is always fed to us that it's individual people. It's the individual support worker. It's that one disabled student staff members in the services. It's that one person that's in their academic school that keeps them in education. Despite all the barriers that we've talked about, it's individual people that make a difference. So if you're listening to this and you are not a disability services member, you're not a vice chancellor or a pro vice chancellor, but you're just an academic, remember to be human and to recognize that all us disabled people are at heart just human as well, and to foster those extra relationships of inclusion and welcoming that a disabled student might need to stay in education. Because it really is each individual that can truly make a difference for a disabled student's experience. And that's the only thing that I would say truly makes, at the moment, can truly keep a student in education.
Perfect.
Don't underestimate the strength in disabled students, talking to disabled students and supporting each other. Again, it's that lived experience, it's that camaraderie and that sharing of empathy and shared well-being that is so powerful. So yeah, keep working together.
Perfect. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.